Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started. It's 4 o'clock, so I'm sure many of your colleagues will be joining in the next few minutes, but we'll get started since it is 4, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time as always. Welcome to, I guess, what is now week 4. So, believe it or not, we are now almost a month into spring semester, which is, for me at least, very difficult to believe. But we are progressing along very quickly in this class, and as a hybrid course, the time goes by quickly. We go through information very quickly as well. So much so that we are now up to almost the midterm assessment point of the class. And so I had told you, promised you that I would make the midterm assessment available at least 2 weeks before it is due. And we are at that point now, that we are 2 weeks away from the due date for the midterm assessment. So I just want everyone to be aware that it is available. And I thought that would be a good practice, like I usually do, is to go through the midterm assessment here in class, read through all the scenarios, read through the questions, and just make sure that everyone is comfortable with what's being asked on the midterm and also comfortable with the expectations for the answers that you should be providing. So we'll start off class tonight talking about the midterm assessment. And then once we're done talking about the midterm assessment, then we'll move into our substantive material for the evening. And that material looks primarily at the scope of government and comparing public sector to private sector. So we will go through some of the similarities and differences between public and private organizations. We will allude back to the Graham Allison article in the classics text number 36, which I hope you had a chance to take a look at, because that will certainly form the basis for much of what we will be discussing in class this evening. So we'll talk about all that. We'll probably also then have time to get into a discussion of public administration as a field and as an academic discipline. We'll talk about what makes for an academic discipline, and then we'll discuss whether or not we think that public administration is an academic discipline, not to come to any conclusion tonight, because in order to conclusively answer that question, you'll need some of the information that we are going to be covering in class next week on the theoretical perspectives within the field of public administration. So we'll get through all that information, and then if we have enough time remaining, then we may do some breakout groups. And I've got a really quick, very simple assignment that we can do in breakout groups. Hopefully we'll have more folks joining us along the way so we can actually do breakout groups, but we'll see how that goes, and we'll just kind of play it by ear and see how quickly we progress through all of our information. But before I get into a discussion of the midterm assessment, just a quick reminder that you have Canvas essay number 3, which is coming due next week. Canvas essay number 3 takes the information we're covering tonight, looking at the differences between and similarities between public and private organizations, and then using that as the basis for your Canvas essay. So I'm asking you to do in Canvas essay number 3 is to take an organization. If you want to use your organization, you certainly are welcome to do that. If you are not currently working in an organization or you're not comfortable using your organization, you can select any other organization that you're familiar with or that you are interested in, and then compare a public organization to a private sector organization, 2 similarities and 2 differences between those 2 different organizations. If you're currently working in a private organization, then just reverse the logic and take that private organization and compare it to a public organization, 2 similarities and 2 differences. If you're working in a nonprofit organization, that's absolutely fine as well. That's great. You can use that organization if you would like as the basis for the essay. So your approach to Canvas essay number 3 should be similar to your approaches to Canvas essay number 1 and Canvas essay number 2. Everyone, I think, is doing a really nice job on the Canvas essays, and all the answers are meeting my expectations. So just keep doing what you're doing for Canvas essay number 3, and everyone should be in really good shape. I do want to make mention to one other thing as well, and that's we had the draft advancement to candidacy form that was due by midnight today. If you turned in your draft advancement to candidacy form and didn't include the years and semesters in which you plan on taking your courses, or didn't include a list of electives that you plan on taking, if you could please resubmit so that I can really see what your course sequencing looks like and what types of electives you're planning on taking so that I can really provide you some feedback. so that once you are ready to formally advance a candidacy after your first semester is done, you've got 2 courses done, then you'll be ready to go ahead and formally advance. And that's the whole purpose of the draft advancement form, is just to get you ready to then formally advance a candidacy whenever you are eligible. Okay, I'm sharing out on the screen the midterm assessment. So let's take a few minutes and go through the midterm assessment. This assessment is brand new for this semester. So we have new questions and new scenarios on this assessment. The scenarios that I'm including are scenarios that I write, and so they're not pulled from anywhere online. So you're not going to find them on the internet. It's something that I write myself, and I try and keep them as concise as possible, giving you the information you need in order to answer the questions without, again, giving too much information, forcing you to get bogged down in a lot of superfluous information. But just to recap, as we had talked about before, the midterm assessment consists of 5 different scenarios, and then there are 2 questions related to each one of those scenarios. Now, the purpose of the assessment is not to find right and wrong answers. So there are not necessarily right and wrong answers to these questions. The purpose of the assessment is truly that it's an assessment mechanism so that we can see how well you can take information that you have learned in the class to date and then apply that information appropriately to address the questions and the scenarios. So we're not looking for the quote unquote best answer. We're looking for the most appropriate answer for that scenario. So the premium is really placed upon your ability to discuss and justify the answers that you are providing. So people could address these questions in a multitude of different ways, and all those ways could be considered to be full credit if you do a good job of justifying the answer that you are providing. So each scenario, 5 scenarios, each one worth a total of 20 points, 2 questions related to each one of those scenarios. So let's walk through those scenarios if you haven't taken a look at them yet, and just make sure everyone is comfortable with what you're going to be doing then on this midterm assessment. So our first scenario looks at the information that we covered in our first real class session together. We talked about the Constitution, the constitutional basis of public administration. So as discussed in class, the Constitution received ratification from the requisite number of states relatively quickly. However, New York was slow to ratify. The goal of developing the Bill of Rights and writing the Federalist Papers was to convince the citizens of New York and the anti-Federalists to support the new Constitution. The work we currently do as public administrators is directly affected by the liberties and freedoms incorporated in the Bill of Rights. This is why one of those ASPA principles is to uphold the Constitution and the law. So our qualified good faith immunity means we have to be aware of these liberties and these freedoms. In question 1A, select 3 freedoms discussed in the Bill of Rights and discuss how these freedoms affect the work of public administrators. The freedoms you pick are completely up to you: freedom of speech, freedom of press, right? Whichever ones you want to select from the Bill of Rights, you can select 3 of those, and then discuss how they may affect the work of a public administrator. And then in 1B, we're focusing on Federalist Paper number 39. We spent some time in class going through Federalist 39. We talked about the arguments that Madison made in order to convince New Yorkers to support the new Constitution. We talked about how Madison kind of deconstructed the Constitution into its component elements. So here I'm saying Madison made a compelling argument for the new Constitution in Federalist Paper number 39. Select and discuss 3 arguments made by Madison in Federalist 39 to convince anti-Federalists to support the new Constitution. There are multiple arguments that he makes. I'm just asking that you select 3 of those arguments that Madison makes and then discuss those arguments. So the first scenario is the constitutional basis for public administration. As I'm sure you would guess, the second scenario then looks at accountability and ethics, a lot of that information that we talked about in the second half of class last week. The city of South Terra Verde is a quickly growing community adjacent to a large metropolitan area. South Terra Verde has decided to construct a large public park in the center of town to accommodate the recreation needs of its growing population. The City Council has been discussing the issue for the past 2 months and plans to discuss the purchase of land for this park again at their next council meeting, with a possible vote on the purchase also scheduled for this same meeting. Councilmember Hayes recently, as of last week, purchased a tract of land within the area for the proposed city park. Councilmember Hayes plans to participate in the discussion and to also vote on the city's purchase of the land for the park. Question 2A, if Mr. Hayes participates in the discussion and votes on the proposed land purchase, what principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics would this potentially violate and why? And then in 2B, are you concerned about Mr. Hayes' purchase of the land? Why or why not? So again, this kind of tracks with our discussion of Tammany Hall and the passages that I shared with you from George Washington Plunkett's memoirs about him doing a somewhat similar thing, and then what types of the principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct would be violated by this action. So that's your accountability and ethics scenario. And then we have scenario number 3. Scenario number 3 looks at some of the information that we are covering tonight in terms of differences between the public and private sectors. So the Midtown Unified School District has seen its student population increase by 40% over the past 2 years. This growth is forecast to continue for the next 10 years due to development within the city's jurisdiction. Faced with this exponential growth in student population, the district needs to construct new schools quickly. The district decides to construct a school on the east side of the city by funding the school with bonds. And if you're familiar with public finance, you know that whenever local governments borrow money, they do it through the issuance of bonds. And so if they issue a bond, then investors will come along and purchase that bond. And then the money that investors pay to purchase the bond, that money goes then to the government. And the government then uses that money to then construct this capital project. So the nice thing about borrowing money, the nice thing about using bonds is that when you issue a bond, those bond proceeds will come in maybe within 6 to 8 weeks. And then you have all the money that you need to construct this new project. If you had to pay for it as you go in terms of just raising tax rates, and you just raise tax rates every year, that incremental amount of money you get every year would not be then sufficient to construct the building. So you'd be building that building over a 20-year period of time. With a bond, you're able to build it over a 12 or 18-month period of time and have that building ready to go, and then you pay it off over a 20 or 30-year period. So that's how we usually construct capital projects at the local level. So the school district decides to issue a bond. They decide to borrow money to build a school. The construction costs for this school are estimated to be $65 million, and construction should take 18 months. The district also entered into an agreement with a developer to construct another school on the western edge of the city. The school will be completely built by the developer with little to no district interaction. This school will be identical to the school to the east and is estimated to cost $45 million and to take 12 months to complete. This is a common occurrence in a lot of quickly developing cities, whereby cities and the school district will enter into what are called mitigation agreements with developers. And so since developers are building all these new homes that will attract all these new residents into this area, all those new residents are going to then place a strain, if you will, on the existing infrastructure. Meaning, where are all those kids going to go to school? You need extra schools to accommodate those kids. It will put extra strain on things like libraries and fire stations and police stations. And so they enter into these mitigation agreements where developers agree to construct these facilities, and they then get the privilege, if you will, to then build their communities and build their developments. So for this school that is being constructed by the private sector contractor, it's estimated to cost $45 million and to take 12 months to complete. Question 3A, what explains the discrepancy in the time to completion and the cost between those two schools? The cost and the period of time to completion for the school being constructed by the school district, and then the one that's being constructed by this private contractor, by this private developer. What are some of the disadvantages to allowing a private sector developer to construct the school on the west side of the city? So what are some of the drawbacks of the school district allowing this developer to build that school? And again, this is information we're going to talk about tonight when we talk about differences between public and private sector organizations. Then scenario number 4 is your scenario that looks at public administration as a discipline. As you know, or as we know, Woodrow Wilson's classic article, The Study of Administration, formed the basis for a separate field of the study of administration. One of the enduring concepts that emerged in the article was the idea of this politics administration dichotomy. And in the last part of class tonight, we will talk about Wilson's article. You are scheduled to read it then by next week. So we'll kind of foreshadow some of those arguments that Wilson made in his article, in which he talks about this politics administration dichotomy. So then question 4A, describe Wilson's argument for why we need a separate study of public administration. And then in 4B, describe the politics administration dichotomy and why this dichotomy is no longer as valid as it once may have been. And this is information that we talked about a little bit last time when we talked about accountability and ethics. We'll talk a lot more about it tonight. And so by the conclusion of our class session tonight, you should really have all the information that you need to successfully complete scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, scenario 5, you won't get that information to answer scenario 5 until class next week, because scenario 5 looks at the theoretical perspectives in public administration. And that's going to be our topic for next week's class. The Department of Housing in the city of Tyler Heights is a large old organization in the state of New Mexico. Its primary function is to make adequate and affordable housing available to income-eligible residents in the city. As an older organization, the Department of Housing has developed an extensive set of policies and procedures. As we'll talk about next week, sometimes as organizations age, those organizations develop a lot of rules and regulations. Those rules and regulations are intended to make sure that we're treating everyone as equally as possible. The problem with rules and regulations is when you get too many of them, they become what we call the dreaded red tape. And you have too many rules and regulations, it means that the organization really starts to define its goal as adhering to its rules and regulations, as opposed to its primary goal being serving the wants, needs, and desires of the citizens that it's meant to serve. So this is kind of your classic bureaucratic organization that has developed all these policies, rules, and procedures. Employees are held accountable and evaluated based upon how closely they adhere to these policies and procedures. So instead of being evaluated on how well they're doing the job in terms of how well they're meeting the needs of citizens, they're being evaluated based upon how well they are adhering to policies and procedures. As such, employee turnover is high as employees feel they are not valued and have very few opportunities to develop their skills through training. There is little vertical and horizontal communication occurring in the organization. So question 5A, select 2 classical organization theorists or theories that you feel would benefit the organization. Discuss these theories and why they would be beneficial for the organization. Next week, I will walk you through an evolution and development of the theories in the field of public administration, especially those theories that focus primarily on how we study public organizations. And as we go through that evolution, we will start our discussion with what we call the classical school of public organization theory. We'll back it up to the late 1800s. We'll talk about people like Max Weber and Frederick Taylor and Luther Gulick and Henri Fayolle and some of those classical types of theorists and how they defined effective and efficient organizations. So those are what we consider the classic organization theorists. So we'll be picking 2 of those classic organization theorists that we talk about next week that you think could have some benefit for the organization. And then in 5B, you'll select 2 what we call neoclassical organization theorists. A neoclassical organization theorist is a theorist whose theories developed after the classical period. So they oftentimes developed in response to those classical theories. So theories such as human relations theory, theories like human resource management theory, systems theory, organization culture theory. Those are all the ones we consider to be neoclassical theories that we'll talk about next week. Select two of those theories or theorists that you think would be beneficial to the organization and discuss why you think they would be beneficial. So again, you'll have all the information after tonight to do scenarios 1 through 4. You'll have to wait until next week to get the information that you need to do scenario number 5. So the midterm assessment is available to you on the Canvas site. You can start working on it at any time that you would like. You may use whatever resources you need to in order to complete the midterm assessment. And by that, I mean any information from our lectures and discussions on Tuesday evenings, any information from the Don Kettle textbook or from the classics articles that you will be reading, any information from our participation in the Canvas essay, the discussion board area of the Canvas site, any of those additional documents that I provided for you on our Canvas site, all of that is fair game. You do not have to go out and do outside research in order to answer these questions. You can answer the questions by using just the information that you've acquired here in the class. And that is what I would prefer, because I'm really using this as very much an assessment mechanism. So I want to assess the competencies and the concepts and the theories that you have acquired up to that point in time in this course. It's not really meant to be a research type of assignment. So as such, you don't have to get outside resources. You don't have to worry about doing citations for this. This is not a paper assignment. This is an assessment. Also, as an assessment in public administration, we always try and be as concise and parsimonious as possible. So the natural question, and it's a good one, is, well, how long do my answers have to be in order to do well on the midterm assessment? They do not have to be very long at all. In fact, a paragraph or two for each one of the questions, I think, would certainly suffice. Now, certainly, if you need to go beyond a couple of paragraphs, that's understandable. I'm not going to stop reading after I've read 2 paragraphs for the question, but you can always go beyond that. But you don't have to, write a thesis or a dissertation for these 1 or 2 paragraphs. Certainly would be a parsimonious answer to each one of these questions. So that's the midterm assessment. Are there any initial questions about the midterm assessment? You've probably already located it on the Canvas site, but if you haven't, let me go ahead and share out our Canvas site with you. And it's disappeared. So let me just share my screen. It always tends to do that with Canvas, is that even though the screen is open, when you go to share it, it won't allow you to share that individual screen. So you have to go and share your entire screen. So let's go into our section here, PPA 500 section 2. I put this in student view. That's why there's that obnoxious purple little thing on the bottom. That just reminds me it's in student view. But when you go in, just go into modules. When you go into the modules, just scroll on down. And if you go down to module number 5, you'll see the midterm assessment is published right here. It is due by Tuesday, February the 27th. So you have a full 2 weeks to work on that. It's due by midnight, by 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m. on February 27th. So you just click on the link, and after you click on the link, it'll take you to the submission area. Here is the link to the assessment, so you can go ahead and download that. I think it's probably easier, and this has worked well in the past, when people just download the assessment and then you enter your answers directly into that Word document. And so after question 1A, you just put your answer to question 1A. After question 1B, you put your answer to question 1B. A lot of people like to put their answers in a different color font so that they stand out a little bit from the question. So some people like to put their answers in red. Some like to put them in blue. Some like to put their answers in with track changes. However you like to do it, I'm fine with whatever approach. It's just a lot easier if you put your answers directly into the assessment itself. Then once you put your answers into the Word file, then just go ahead and save it. I don't have any required naming convention. In some of your future courses, you're going to have instructors who do have naming conventions that they expect. I don't. You can call it whatever you would like to call it, but just save it and then just click the upload button, and you can then just attach it there, hit submit, and then you submitted your midterm assessment. The nice thing about this is whenever I go through and review it and put a grade in, then that grade automatically populates into the grade book. So I don't have to go in the grade book and put the grades in independently. Everything automatically populates into the grade book. And what I usually like to do is I will have a feedback box there and I'll provide you with feedback. If there are any points that were deducted for anything, there will be an explanation for why those points were deducted. I never take off points unless I tell you why those points were taken off. So you always have a justification if you lose any points at all on the midterm assessment. So that is the midterm assessment. Again, you can start working on it whenever you see fit. It's due in 2 weeks. Any questions as you are working on the midterm assessment? As always, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. If there are any clarifications needed, my advice always is don't overthink the answers on the midterm assessment. I'm not trying to trip you up. I'm not trying to throw you curveballs. I mean, these are all kind of fastballs right down the middle of the plate. If you have attended the class and you've watched the recordings and you've read the readings, you're going to do really well on the midterm assessment. So this is nothing to try and make you get a C or something like that. Everyone tends to do really well on the midterm assessment if they have actually been putting forth what I like to call the old graduate school try in the class. People tend to do pretty well. I do not worry too much about grade distributions in this class. I'm much more interested in you acquiring the information that you need in order to be successful as you move throughout the MPA program. That is my number one concern. So I don't care one bit about grade distributions. Usually the grades in this course tend to be higher than what you typically see in some of your other courses in the MPA program, because this is very much an introductory foundational type of course. Okay, so that's our housekeeping items for this evening. So with that all taken care of, let's go ahead and jump into our material for tonight. And again, the primary topic for the first part of class tonight is this discussion of the differences between public and private administration. And we're going to talk about some of those basic differences to begin with, and then we'll later on get into the Graham Allison article. We'll kind of put together a typology of the similarities between the two sectors, and then a typology of the differences between those two sectors as well. And again, all this is being done for the purpose of building toward the discussion of what is public administration and whether or not public administration is an academic discipline. So this is kind of like a means to an end. So we know that public administration is immense. Public administration, bureaucracies, bureaucratic organizations, laws, rules, procedures, they are ubiquitous. We encounter them everywhere. From the moment we wake up in the morning and you go and you eat your breakfast, the quality of the breakfast that you're eating in terms of its safety, that's going to be regulated by governments. From the time you walk out your door and you get in your car is going to be subject to regulations in terms of fuel efficiency standards, in terms of safety standards. The road that you drive on is a road that most likely is probably paved with public taxpayer dollars and probably maintained by the city in which you live, or perhaps if you're in an unincorporated area, by the county. Just about when you get to work, the OSHA regulations in terms of worker safety and workplace safety also have major impacts upon our everyday lives. So just about every aspect of our daily lives will be touched in one way or another by governments and by bureaucratic organizations. Since bureaucracy touches just about every aspect of our lives, we encounter it every single day, which then makes bureaucracy the source of a great deal of debate among the public. And usually when people think about bureaucracies, they usually think about bureaucracies in relatively negative terms. And so if I would say the word bureaucracy to you, we'll just do a little free word association. So I say bureaucracy, what do you think of? What pops into your mind when I say bureaucracy?
Delay.
Delay, absolutely. Yeah, it's a slow, very gradual process to get things done. There's oftentimes a lot of delay. Those delays can occur in terms of getting hired to work in a bureaucratic organization. Those delays occur in terms of the policies, writing the specific implementation rules that will govern laws. The mere passage of those laws also tends to be filled with delays. It's a very slow, gradual, and sometimes very painful process. Uh, Building capital projects can be a very slow, very painful process as well. So I would agree. There's a whole lot of delay built into bureaucracies. What else? Anything else? You can also use text chat if you prefer. I have my chat box open so I can keep an eye on any comments that go into there. But what else when we say bureaucracy?
Building off of the last one, also busy, since there typically tends to be like a lot of different levels to every organization.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, organizations, they are very formal, structured organizations. They have very lots of different levels within those organizations. We have a lot of that division of labor and specialization of tasks going on within our organizations. And sometimes it does make it very confusing for citizens whenever they have to interface with these organizations. They're sometimes not sure what organization to contact. And once they do locate the correct organization to contact, they don't really know who they should be contacting within that organization. And so sometimes bureaucratic organizations tend to be shrouded in this mystery for a lot of our members of the public. And there are oftentimes these barriers that are established between a bureaucratic organization and the citizens that that organization serves. That's a theory in public administration known as institutional rigidity. That as organizations become older, they develop more rules and policies and procedures. They tend to grow in size. And when they grow in size, they develop more and more positions and more layers to the organization. And all of that then creates these artificial walls between this institutionally rigid organization and the people the organization is supposed to serve, which then makes it more difficult for people to then come into contact with that organization. And then that also then hurts us in terms of trying to meet those principles we talked last week in the ASPA code of conduct, things such as promoting democratic participation, and fully informing and advising. And so those tend to be kind of negative associations that we have with the bureaucracy. People think about the bureaucracy in terms of being very impersonal. They got all these rules and all these regulations, but you don't really tailor those rules, regulations, and approaches to the wants, needs, and desires of individual citizens. So it tends to be a relatively impersonal type of situation. There's a very famous public administration theorist who wrote back in the 1970s by the name of Charles Goodsell, and it's spelled just like it sounds, Goodsell. And Charles Goodsell wrote this book called The Case for the Bureaucracy. And in his case for the bureaucracy, he talked about how people tend to have these very negative views of the bureaucracy, fueled primarily by their contact with that organization. So it's possible you could have someone who has had 10 interactions with a bureaucratic organization. Nine of those interactions have been satisfying in that they got done what they want to get done 9 of those 10 times. But one time they had a negative experience. And that one negative experience is what then fuels their entire negative view of the entire bureaucracy. Oftentimes we think of bureaucracies as kind of being this monolithic term without recognizing that bureaucracies are really made up of multiple different types of organizations. Some of those organizations are certainly going to be more efficient and more effective than other organizations. But in public administration, that is what we study. We study public bureaucracy. Public bureaucracy really refers to public organizations. So it's very hard in public administration. We study different aspects of public organizations. We study how those organizations are structured. We study what the functions of those organizations are. We study the people who populate positions within those organizations. We study how organizations interact with other organizations. We study how organizations interact with their surrounding environment. But at the very heart of public administration, we are focusing on these public organizations. So a definition of public bureaucracy is that we're looking at public organizations, which are the formal rational system of relations among people vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. That's a kind of lengthy type of definition. So let's go back and deconstruct it. So we're talking about we're studying the formal rational system of relations. So first off, it is formal in that it is written down. We have these formal organization charts. We have these formal rules and policies and procedures and regulations. So it's a very formal type of arrangement. And it's also a rational system in that there is some rational thought that has gone into how to structure this organization and how this organization operates on a daily basis. So it's a formal rational system of relationships among persons vested with administrative authority. And here is one of those big differences between studying public administration and private administration. These people who are working, these bureaucrats who are working these organizations, are vested with administrative authority. That authority is coming indirectly from the public. So the authority under social contract theory comes from the public, and it then gets translated through elected officials and policies and procedures that then move on to public administrators, onto these bureaucrats. But these bureaucrats have this formal administrative legal authority, which is different than the basis of authority in a private corporation. If you think about the term government and what makes something a government, we have a lot of governments around the world. We have a lot of governments here in the United States. We have 50 state governments and we have tens of thousands of local governments. Typically, when we think about the term government, a government usually has two primary criteria. One criteria for being a government is that you have control over a jurisdiction. So you have control over an area. So in the United States, the national government has control over the boundaries of the nation. The state of California has a degree of control over the boundaries of the state of California. So you have control over a jurisdiction. And then the second criteria is coercive power. This gets us back to our discussion of power that we had a couple of weeks ago. But you have coercive power, meaning that you can coerce your citizens to take certain actions they otherwise would not take. So governments can coerce citizens to pay their taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, there will be civil and criminal penalties for not paying your taxes. People are coerced to serve on juries. If they don't serve on juries and they ignore the summons, they can be jailed for ignoring that summons. If you want to get financial aid and you're over the age of 18, you have to register with the Selective Service. That's something that is still a requirement. That's a coercive power that government has where it can force its citizens to do something they otherwise may not do. That's a coercive power. That's an authority that exists in the public sector and not really to that same level over in the private sector. So we're looking at the relationships between these persons who have administrative authority and for what purpose? To carry out public programs. So the programs that they are carrying out are public programs. They are providing public goods and services as opposed to the private goods and services that will be created over in the private sector. And at the risk of digressing a little bit here, I think it's important for us to really illustrate some of those differences between what we would consider to be a public good or service versus what we consider to be a private good or service. And this is a topic that you'll cover a little bit more at length when you get into your 555 government budgeting and finance course. But there are different types of goods. There can be what we consider to be pure private goods. A pure private good is a good that is exhaustible and excludable, meaning that it can be used up. So people are rivals for the consumption of that pure private good. So you've got a candy bar sitting on the shelf in a convenience store, and there's one candy bar on that shelf. Two people go in to try and purchase that candy bar. They are rivals to get the benefits of that candy bar. Once that candy bar has been purchased by that one person, the other person then, at least temporarily, cannot get that candy bar because it's been exhausted. So they are exhaustible, and they're also excludable. That candy bar costs 75 cents and you only have 25 cents in your pocket, you're going to be excluded from purchasing that candy bar. So that's a pure private type of good. In pure private goods, we typically see private sector provision and private sector production. And this is an important distinction for this discussion of differences between public and private sectors. The provision production distinction. So provision means providing or giving the resources that will make the production process possible. If you're going to create a good or service, it's going to require resources. So when you give the resources to make production possible, that's what we call provision. Production is the actual creation of that good or that service. So when the factory actually makes that Three Musketeers bar, that's considered the production process. With a pure private good, we normally anticipate that the private sector provides the resources and the private sector produces that good or that service. So that's a pure private good. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you have pure public goods. Pure public goods are non-exhaustible and non-excludable. So in a pure public good, it cannot be used up. We are not necessarily rivals for it. So you think about the classic pure public good of national defense. So I derive a benefit from national defense, and the benefit I derive from national defense does not reduce the benefit that you can derive from national defense. So it's non-exhaustible, and it's also non-excludable in that we don't charge fees attached to the benefit you're getting from national defense. We are going to pay for national defense oftentimes out of general tax dollars. So it's considered to be not able to be exhausted and not able to exclude people. That's a pure public good. With a pure public good, we typically anticipate that the provision will be done by the public sector, and the production will then also be done by the public sector as well. So that's what we consider to be a pure public type of good or program. But those are polar opposites. There must be something in between. And in that gray area in between a pure private and pure public good, we have two other types of goods. There's what's called a toll good and what's called a collective pool good. And toll goods and collective pool goods exist in this gray area between the polar opposites of a pure private good and a pure public good. With a toll goods are excludable, but they are non-exhaustive. They are not exhaustible. So you think about a toll road. And, in the old days, I know now we have transponders and all that fancy stuff. But in the old days, you pull up to a toll road and there is a bar that keeps you from driving on the toll road until you throw your change in the basket. And then the bar goes up and you can then drive on the toll road. If you don't have the toll to pay, then you're excluded from driving on that toll road. So it is excludable. However, everyone who has the money to pay to make that bar go up and drive on that toll road, they can drive on that toll road. So me driving on the toll road does not exhaust it for your ability to drive on the toll road. You may have to wait until I get out of your way, but we can all drive on the toll road if we've paid the toll. That's considered to be a toll good. A collective pool good is the opposite of a toll good. So with a collective pool good, it's non-excludable, but it is exhaustible. So things such as natural resources, the rights to mineral pools and things such as that, they tend to be non-excludable because everyone has a right to them. But once they are used up, they are gone. So they can be exhausted. So these toll and these collective pool goods fall in between. And this is where we argue a lot about provision and production. Who does what? So with the toll and collective pool goods, you can have an arrangement where you have public provision and private sector production. That's your typical privatization, what we call contracting out. So the school district wants to construct a school. The school district obviously is not going to do it itself because it doesn't have the employees to be able to do that. And so therefore it will put out a request for proposals, and then you'll get all these bids coming in from private sector contractors, and then you'll accept the lowest bid that you receive. That's the public contracting type of process. That's a process whereby the contract is being paid for by the government, but the actual production of creating that building is being done by the private sector. So public provision, private sector production. You can also have the inverse of that, where you have private provision and public production. Now, those examples are much rarer. We don't see those examples quite as much. But you think about a situation such as if you have a private concert promoter, and that concert promoter wants to have security at the venue. So the private concert promoter then pays the local police department to actually go to the venue and actually do the security on the night of the concert. That's private provision because the police department is being paid by a private concert promoter, but the actual production of security is being done by that local police department. So it's important to note that the types of things that are being created, the programs, the goods, the services being created by the public sector are somewhat different than the goods that are created by the private sector. So here we're talking about public organizations that are carrying out these public programs, programs that are inherently public by their very nature. The problem for the bureaucracy is, again, as Charles Goodsell tells us, people tend to have a very negative view of the bureaucracy. People tend to view the quote unquote bureaucracy as being too inefficient to accomplish anything of value, while at the same time being made up of too efficient users or abusers of power. That they oftentimes think of bureaucracy as, well, it's incompetent in terms of doing the types of things it needs to do. When it comes to abusing power and abusing resources and misusing resources, suddenly those bureaucrats are viewed as being very efficient in their ability to do that. The bureaucracy in general, just using this monolithic term of bureaucracy, is usually held in very low regard by members of the public. And it's kind of down there, not far off of Congress in terms of these public opinion polls. Congress is usually in the low teens in terms of their approval rating. They're usually down around 11 or 12%. Sometimes they dip into the single digits. The bureaucracy is also down in the teens as well in these public opinion polls. So we have some work cut out for us as public administrators to show the public just how important public administration and public organizations are for their everyday lives. Here in public administration, we sometimes suffer from what's called a crisis of identity, in that we work very hard to try and distinguish ourselves from private administration. When you joined the MPA program and you told people you were getting your MPA degree, people may have heard you say MBA, because MBA degrees are much more frequently awarded than MPA degrees. There are actually some programs around the country that merge the two together into one Master's of Administration degree. And there's one program up in the state of Oregon that will remain nameless for now. But when I was on the Commission for Accreditation, that program came up for reaccreditation. And their program actually merges the two together so much that they admit everyone to the same Master of Administration program. And then in 1 year, the culminating case study will be a business administration case study focusing on a private corporation. And then the next year, it'll be a public administration case study focusing on a government organization or a nonprofit organization. So there are some programs that really do kind of merge the two together, but we really work hard in public administration to illustrate how the study of public organizations differs from the study of private organizations. Now, a couple of basic ways in which they differ, obviously, as we said before, it's the role of public authority, that these organizations are created through enabling legislation that's being passed by legislative bodies that are populated by elected officials. Those elected officials are elected directly by the public. So when you're working in a government organization, working on a public program, that organization, that program has that type of public legal authority. That's something that a lot of private corporations obviously will lack. Also, one of the main differences are these characteristic organizational processes that go on in the public sector compared to the private sector. And we'll talk about these a little bit later on, but things such as how we hire people, how we evaluate people, how we promote people, how we sanction discipline people, how we manage money, how we raise money, the sources of our revenue are different in the public as compared to the private sector, as we talked about last week when we talked about efficiency. So a lot of the processes that go on in the public sector are distinctive from the processes that go on in the private sector. And as Graham Allison will tell us in his article, the big difference is not really what organizations do. The big difference is really in how they do it. And the public sector, public administrators contribute to and participate in both policy formulation as well as policy implementation and execution. So administrators are involved in helping design policies, and they're also then involved in implementing those policies. In the private sector, private organizations are much less involved in policy formation, but they are still involved in policy implementation. So again, for public sector, we do both formulation as well as implementation. For private sector, primarily the role is in implementation, oftentimes through implementing those regulations that are being applied to these private corporations by governmental entities. Here's another interesting way of distinguishing between public and private organizations, and that's this federal law known as the Anti-Deficiency Act. The Federal Anti-Deficiency Act forbids government officials from spending on anything that is not explicitly authorized by law. Whereas private organizations can spend on pretty much anything they want as long as that is not forbidden by law. So in the public sector, we can only spend on what the law tells us we can spend on, how that money is legally appropriated. In the private sector, you can spend your money however you want, as long as how you're spending it is not forbidden and prohibited by law. So as you can see, the private sector has a lot more flexibility in terms of how they spend their money and what they spend their money on as compared to public organizations. Now, this Anti-Deficiency Act was very much in the news in the last presidential administration. So in the Trump administration, there's this very big reform to our federal income tax policy, was known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I always get it mixed up, but it's the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the act attempted to try and streamline the federal income tax system. It removed exemptions, so you can no longer claim exemptions on your taxes. It also placed certain limitations upon certain types of deductions, such as the state and local tax deduction. It limited that to $10,000. And so in a high tax state like California, in the past, you may be paying, $25,000 a year in state and local taxes, but you can only deduct up to $10,000 of that for your federal income taxes under this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So it was a huge change. It's the biggest change to the federal income tax system since 1986 in the Tax Reform Act in the Reagan administration. Caused a lot of confusion. And so a lot of taxpayers, when they went to file their taxes, they had a whole lot of questions about what they could deduct, what they couldn't deduct. And so they started calling up the IRS. The problem was that we had a government shutdown, a partial government shutdown. One of the areas of the government that was being partially shut down was the Department of Treasury. Well, the IRS is part of the Department of Treasury. And so as a result of this partial government shutdown, these IRS agents who were doing these customer service types of jobs, they were told to stay home. You're being furloughed, don't come into work. And so taxpayers, at the same time where they were calling the IRS in record numbers trying to get their questions answered, the phones were ringing and ringing and ringing because there was no one working to answer those phones. The Trump administration knew this was a problem politically because these folks needed to get their questions answered, because all these questions are coming because of this new tax law that was championed by the administration. So the Trump administration wanted to get these IRS agents back on the job and to pay them when they got them back on the job. Problem with that is that the appropriation bill had not yet been passed. So there was no legal authority to pay these IRS agents if they came back to work. That's an example of the Anti-Deficiency Act. The Trump administration could not pay them because there was no explicit authorization on the appropriation bill for those IRS agents to be paid. So it makes kind of seem like an archaic piece of legislation, but it's something that really does affect us on a daily basis and was a very prominent discussion that was going on in the last presidential administration. But again, it's a good illustration of some of the differences between public and private sectors. I think another great illustration of the similarities and differences between the two sectors comes to us from this Graham Allison article. And I hope you had a chance to take a look at the Graham Allison article. It's article number 36 in the classics text, the Shaffer's text. It begins on page 384. And Allison titles his article, Public and Private Management, Are They Fundamentally Alike in All Unimportant Respects? And it's an interesting title because he's saying, are they alike, but all alike in very unimportant ways? So what Allison does for us in the article is he lays out for us, here are some similarities between the public and private sectors, and then here are some differences. So let's start with some of those similarities. So according to Allison, what are some of the similarities between public and private sector organizations? How are they similar? If you've ever worked in a private organization than a public organization or vice versa, some of these similarities might be apparent to you. What are some of the things that are similar between organizations? What do all organizations have to do, regardless of sector? Serve customers, absolutely. They have to serve customers, they have to serve citizens. They are producing these goods and services, these programs that hopefully will meet the wants, needs, and desires of their citizens, their consumers. Both organizations and both sectors do that. They have people who they have to provide services to. And so, yes, they both serve their customers. What else do they both do? Profit is an interesting one in that, yes, in the private sector, private organizations certainly operate to make a profit. And there are some examples of government organizations that also operate to make a profit as well. Example of that would be something like a government corporation. And so we have organizations like the US Postal Service. US Postal Service operates to make a profit. They usually don't, but at least in theory, they operate to make a profit. It's true for a certain number of government-sponsored enterprises as well. So we do have some government organizations in the public sector that do operate to make a profit. The vast majority do not, but we do have that profit incentive on the part of some public organizations and on the part of just about all private sector organizations. Anything else? Any other similarities that we see between the two sectors or between the two different types of organizations? If you think about it from the perspective of being a leader or a manager in an organization, as a leader or a manager in an organization, you will engage in some of the same functions in a private corporation that you would engage in a public organization. So things such as strategic planning. Private corporations engage in strategic planning. They establish goals and objectives and then come up with action plans to achieve those goals and those objectives. Public sector organizations do strategic planning as well. They establish their goals and their objectives and their action plans. So all organizations engage in planning, strategic planning. All organizations have to organize their workers and organize their resources. Private corporations have organization charts. Public organizations have organization charts as well. So we both engage in organizing. Both types of organizations engage in staffing, according to Graham Allison. They have to hire people with the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job. So we're hiring people regardless of whether we're hiring them to work in a corporation or hiring them to work in a government agency. So both organizations do staffing. Both organizations have to have some element of directing in that leaders and managers must direct the efforts of their employees to make sure that those efforts are working together to accomplish our goals and our objectives. Leaders and managers have to coordinate efforts among all the different people within their organization to, again, make sure everyone is working toward similar goals and similar objectives. We have to have reporting mechanisms to know how well we are accomplishing our goals and objectives. How much progress have we made toward those accomplishment of those objectives? We have to have reporting mechanisms in both sectors. And then we engage in budgeting. Every organization, in order to survive, must have the resources necessary to carry out its daily functions. You have to have the resources to pay the salaries and the benefits of your employees. You need to have the resources in order to pay the leases on the offices that you are leasing. You have to have the resources to purchase the supplies that you need on a daily basis to do the job of the organization. You have to have the resources to pay for the professional development of your employees and training and development. You have to have resources to pay for travel. You have to have resources to pay for maintenance, resources to pay for utilities, and so on and so on. So both private as well as public organizations engage in budgeting, acquiring the resources in order to be able to survive. So I think what Allison is telling us is that there are some similarities between the sectors in terms of what private and public organizations do. They do similar types of functions. And these functions he refers to by the acronym of POSCOR. And there's a reason why I talked about it in that order. POSCORP stands for planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. This acronym known as POSCORP. All organizations engage in those types of functions. The difference, according to Allison, is not what they do, but rather the difference is in how they do it. How you do these functions in the public sector will look and feel a lot different than how you do them in the private sector. So for instance, your staffing function. In the private sector, you are hiring employees who are what are called at-will employees, which means that they work at the pleasure of the organization. It's much easier for you to discipline and terminate or even to reward employees who are at-will employees. As you recruit those employees, the recruitment process is usually a heck of a lot quicker in the private sector. You identify an employee to interview, you bring that person in, you interview them, you like them, you hire them on the spot, and then if HR can process the paperwork quickly enough, then they may be able to start the following morning. So it's a very quick turnaround in terms of recruiting and hiring employees. In the public sector, it's a much more protracted, gradual process. If you work in a public organization, you may have been shocked by just how long it took you to get your position in that organization. Even if you were the most qualified person, you still got a lot of administrative regulations you have to go through in hiring people to work in public organizations. You think about like here at the university, when I was chair, we hired a new full-time faculty member position. In hiring that faculty member position, we created the vacancy announcement in July. That vacancy announcement then had to be reviewed by not only the college, but the Office of Equity and Diversity to make sure that it would appeal to a diverse audience. We then had to put together a recruitment plan that again had to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. That recruitment plan needed to have specific targeted recruitment strategies in order to try and get the most diverse applicant pool we could possibly get to then hopefully make a diversity type of hire. So we had to get that approved. Once the applications came in, that pool of applicants, which we would have a pool of applicants by October, that pool of applicants would then again have to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity for diversity. If there was not a diverse enough pool, then we would have to go out and do another stage of recruitment, another round of recruitment. Once we go through those applicants and we identify semifinalists for Zoom or phone interviews, however you want to do it, that semifinalist pool would then again have to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. That happens somewhere around December. We would then identify 3 finalist candidates to bring to campus. Those 3 finalist candidates would then have to be approved by Equity and Diversity, and they would be identified in January, come to campus in February for interviews, and then we'd end up extending an offer usually in late February or early March. Now we started advertising in July, and we're finally filling the position in early March. That type of a protracted recruitment process is pretty typical of a lot of public organizations. So the recruitment in staffing is a lot different. The selection process is a lot different as well, in that we are based upon merit hiring. And so therefore we need to hire people who have demonstrated they have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job. We can't hire someone because they are the cousin of the hiring official. So it's much different in selecting people in the public sector. Whenever people come into the organization, then their position will be part of a position classification system. We will assign their compensation based upon where their position fits in the position classification system. So there's much less negotiation over salaries in the public sector than you might have in the private sector, because these position classification systems will establish pay grades. And so there will be a minimum and a maximum range for the amount of pay that someone can get in that position on that position classification system. Everyone will have a position description. That position description will detail the jobs of that person, the tasks that person's doing on a daily basis, the amount of time, percentage of time they're spending on those tasks. We have position descriptions for each one of the positions in our public organizations. We do job analysis, we do job evaluation, and we'll talk about all those things when we get to our discussion of the management of human resources. We have to document performance. We have to do performance evaluations for all of our employees in public organizations. If there is deficient performance, we have to document that. We then have to provide opportunities for training and development to remedy those deficiencies. After that training and development is provided, then maybe 6 months later, we'll have to then reevaluate their performance. If the performance is still deficient, then we have to provide them with more training and development opportunities and document at every step of the process. In the private sector, it's not that important because they're at-will employees. And so if they get a negative performance evaluation, you can let them go immediately. You can't do that in the public sector. So the entire personnel, human resource management process, even though we're both doing human resource management, it's much different in the public sector. And why is it much different? Because of this thing called career civil service. Last week, when Kelly was doing her presentation, she mentioned to you the idea of civil service. Career civil service means that these are people who get their job based upon their merit, and they then have protections in that they cannot be dismissed, they cannot be penalized in their positions for political reasons. The only reason that they can be disciplined is for cause, in that because of their work performance, and despite all these training opportunities they've gotten, they still have deficient work performance. All that has to be documented. Everything's based upon performance and merit, as opposed to just being an at-will employee over in the private sector. So it's important that we are working with these career civil servants. Overlay on top of that, the civil service protections, overlay on top of those civil service protections, the fact that public employees tend to be unionized at a much higher level than their private sector counterparts. So whereas over 30% of public employees nationwide tend to belong to public employee unions, about 12% of private sector employees are unionized. So when you have this added unionization, it means that on top of your civil service regulations, you then also have a collective bargaining process. That collective bargaining process results in a contract. That contract will then have stipulations for how you manage your personnel. So all these performance evaluation requirements, all of these disciplinary measures, all these opportunities for training and development and promotions, all of that will be covered in different articles of that contract. So you have a couple of different rules, sets of rules and regulations that you have to adhere to when you're dealing with career civil servants. So again, it's not the what, it's the how that is different. Think about performance measurement. The way we measure performance in the private sector is oftentimes much more empirical and quantitative. And so, to use what the economists call, we have a widget factory. And that widget factory is producing widgets to then sell to consumers. You can measure performance by looking at how many widgets you are producing compared to how much money you are spending on the production process. That's a quantitative measure of performance. You could also look at the specifications of each one of these widgets you are creating and compare their specifications for the purposes of quality control. That's another measure of performance. In the public sector, when you're not making widgets, but instead you are trying to enhance the quality of life of citizens, that's a much more qualitative, much more subjective type of performance measure. So it becomes much more difficult to measure performance from a quantitative basis in the public as compared to the private sector. In the public sector, we serve these many masters, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, which means we have competing standards. We have standards and expectations that are overlaid on top of us from the legislative branch, from the executive branch, from the judicial branch, from national level of government, from state levels of government. You have a lot more competing standards that you have to be held accountable to in the public sector. Obviously, we work within a fishbowl, as it's called in the public sector. There's a heck of a lot more public scrutiny of what we do in public organizations than there is in private corporations. There's a lot more openness and a lot more transparency, as we talked about last week, with things such as public records requests, things such as the Brown Act, conflict of interest forms, a lot more of that public scrutiny. And rightly so, because we are dealing with public taxpayer money. In the public sector, leaders and managers oftentimes have a more difficult time directing employees than in the private sector. Managers in both sectors need to direct employees, but in the public sector, because of all these civil service protections, because of all these protections afforded in the union contract, you don't have the ability to necessarily tell people what to do and then penalize them if they don't do that. That type of micromanagement oftentimes doesn't exist as much in the public as it does in the private sector. So instead, public sector leaders and managers need to engage in much more persuasion. There's a really good anecdote from back in the Eisenhower administration that whenever Eisenhower was elected president, Harry Truman, who was the outgoing president, said that Dwight Eisenhower would be the most frustrated person in Washington, D.C., because Eisenhower was coming out of the military. In the military, as a general, he told someone to do something and they had to do it. As president and as a public administrator, you tell someone to do something, they may not necessarily have to do it. You more have to persuade them than just micromanage them and direct them in what to do. So direction is different in the two sectors. And then obviously there's a lot more oversight, both horizontally through separation of powers, as well as vertically through federalism in public as compared to private sector organizations. So again, the really important thing that comes out of this Graham Allison article, if you haven't read it yet, I please do recommend that you read it because it's going to form the basis for your Canvas essay number 3. But what comes out, the moral of the story is we do similar functions between public and private management. It's how we do the functions that differs. And they differ enough. How we do the functions differs enough to justify this separate study of public organizations within the field of public administration. Now, earlier we had talked about the profit motive. And oftentimes when you ask people, well, public versus private, what's the difference? And they'll say, well, the private sector operates to make a profit, the public sector does not. I think that is a necessary but not sufficient distinction between the two sectors. It is necessary because, yes, the vast majority of private organizations run the profit or try to run a profit. The vast majority of government organizations do not. But as we'd illustrated before, there are government organizations like government corporations that do operate to run a profit. And likewise, in the private sector, there are private non-governmental organizations that do not run a profit, such as nonprofit organizations. So I think the profit motive is an important component, but it's not solely sufficient for distinguishing between the two sectors. When we want to distinguish between the two sectors, we really have to look at how they do their functions differently between a private corporation and a governmental agency. Now, as we had mentioned before, another way to distinguish between public and private sectors is to look at the roles that they play in terms of policy formulation and policy execution and implementation. And when I say execution, implementation, I use those terms interchangeably. I know Kettle likes to say execution. I tend to refer to it as implementation. As we had said before, both public and private organizations are involved in the policy implementation process. They're both involved in implementing rules and regulations. For private corporations, they're usually involved in terms of implementing regulations that are placed upon them by legislative organizations. But when it comes to policy formation, policy formulation, it's really the domain more of public organizations, in that public organizations and public administrators are very much involved in policy formulation. So what's the difference between the two? Policy implementation execution is the task of translating written law into action, actually implementing and executing these laws that are passed by legislative bodies, and sometimes administrative orders, executive orders that are promulgated by a chief executive as well. Policy formulation process is about making the policy, developing the policy itself, advising officials, advising elected officials in the creation of that policy, and then making sense of what that policy means for average, ordinary citizens. Whenever you involve public administrators into the policy formulation process, there are some artifacts, if you will, there are some consequences of doing that. One consequence is the more that we involve public administrators in policy formulation, the more technical our policies will become. Because these public administrators who are working these administrative agencies, they have specialized competence in this policy area. So they're going to bring that specialized competence to bear in the formulation of the policy. So we tend to get more technical policies filled with a little bit more jargon when we have public administrators involved in the formulation process. Also, when you involve public administrators operate, for the vast majority of them, within the executive branch, under the auspices of the chief executive. So whenever you involve public administrators more in the formulation of policy, you are expanding the role of the chief executive as agenda setter, because the chief executive is obviously the chief executive of the federal bureaucracy of those public organizations. So the more we have public administration involved in policy formulation, the more technical our policies become, and the more we heighten the role of the chief executive in creating these policies. So I think today in public administration, we accept the fact that public administrators are involved in both creating the policy as well as implementing the policy. That has not always been the case, and that has not always been the accepted approach. And one of the articles that you're reading for next week is this article by Woodrow Wilson that is called The Study of Administration. And in the study of administration, Woodrow Wilson essentially establishes the framework for having a separate field of study of public administration. And how and why he does that is something that we'll talk about after we take a break. So I think we're probably at a good breaking point right now before we get into Wilson. So let's take a break until about 5:30. If you come back at 5:30, or when you come back at 5:30, we'll then get into a discussion of Woodrow Wilson and this whole thing known as a politics administration dichotomy, and talk a bit about why the politics administration dichotomy is not nearly as true today as it was back in 1887 when it was first created by Woodrow Wilson. So take a break until 5:30 and then come back and we'll talk Woodrow Wilson and politics administration dichotomy. Okay, hey everyone, we are back from break. So let's continue our discussion. Again, the whole purpose of this discussion is to kind of illustrate for us differences between public and private organizations as a justification then for our discussion of public administration as either an academic discipline or as a subfield within another discipline such as political science. And so, the whole purpose of this course is to get you ready then to succeed in the rest of the MPA program. And so understanding what public administration is really elemental to that type of success in a master's of public administration program. So We had mentioned before that this article by Woodrow Wilson back in 1887 called The Study of Administration was really the bedrock of the creation of a separate study of administration, and hence then the beginnings of this study of public administration. And before we get into Wilson's article and some of the arguments he makes in his article, it is also important to recognize who Woodrow Wilson was and some of the limitations attached with whenever you talk about Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a historian. He was president of Princeton University and then ascended to the presidency of the United States. So he had a very well-known historic type of political career. However, as president of the United States, as history has looked back on the Wilson administration, we've come to realize that Wilson actually shared some pretty unsavory types of opinions and beliefs. And one of those unsavory opinions was in terms of race relations. And so he screened some what we would certainly consider now to be very racist and unacceptable performances in the White House. So much so that some schools that bear his name have in recent years actually removed his name from buildings. One of the most prominent ones, obviously, is Princeton University. They have the Wilson School. The building that the Wilson School is housed in is no longer named after Woodrow Wilson, so his name has been removed even from a building on the campus where he used to be president. So it's important to recognize when we talk about Woodrow Wilson, we're talking about him in a very narrow view in terms of his contribution to the creation of the separate study of public administration and the development of the field of public administration. So in his classic study, The Study of Administration, which is the most famous study in the field of public administration, Wilson made the argument that the work of government in the 1880s had become very complex and very complicated. It had become so complex and so complicated that we needed to have a separate field in order to study the work of administrators. When you think about when Wilson wrote his article in 1887, it was on the heels of the passage of this piece of legislation called the Pendleton Act. And I think we had made mention to the Pendleton Act last week, and we'll talk a lot more about the Pendleton Act in upcoming weeks. But the Pendleton Act really did create this career civil service system at the federal level in the federal bureaucracy. The Pendleton Act ushered in this era of merit, whereby instead of hiring people based upon their political affiliations, we started hiring people based upon their qualifications. So we wanted to populate the bureaucracy with people who had the knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to do the job in a competent and benign, politically benign type of fashion. So when he wrote his classic Study of Administration in 1887, he was advocating for if we could think about administration separately from politics. What we could do is if we focus on administration, we could better focus on what he referred to as the business of government. And today some public administration theorists will bristle whenever we talk about business in relation to public administration. But he said there was a business of administration. And the business of administration, the business of government, was the implementation of these policies that were being passed by elected officials. So it kind of creates for us this politics administration dichotomy, where we have a political world that is inhabited by elected officials. Those elected officials in that political world are the ones that create the laws, they create the policies in legislative bodies. That's political work. Then administrators occupy the administrative world. And the job of administrators is then to efficiently and effectively implement these policies. So what he did is he said, we will separate it. So we have elected officials on the political side, we have administrators on the administrative side. And then if we can focus on administration separately from politics, what we can then do is we can borrow administrative innovations from other countries, and then we can apply them here in America. So one of the examples he talks about in his article is the example of civil service. So he rightly says that we did not create civil service here in the United States. We borrowed the concept of civil service from England. For many years, England had their own British system of civil service that greatly predated the civil service system we had here in the US. In the British system of civil service, they would hire people based upon their performance on examinations. So people would take examinations. Those who performed the best on those examinations would then be selected for positions in the British civil service. That's how we made sure we had competent people working in British government. Those examinations that were used in England were closed examinations, meaning that only certain people were allowed to sit for those examinations. Those examinations were not open to the general public. We borrowed this idea of examinations and we brought it to the US in the era of merit. So in the post-Pendleton Act period, we had federal examinations for just about any job you could think of in the federal bureaucracy below political appointees, and people would then sit for those examinations. However, the examination system that we used here in the US was a system of open examinations, whereby anyone could take those examinations to then qualify for a position in the federal bureaucracy. So we took a system of closed exams and we modified it into open examinations to hopefully match our more open political culture. Another example he gives for us of the system of British civil service is the British system of civil service allowed people to enter the British civil service, British government, from the private sector. However, if you were going to enter from the private sector, you had to go all the way to the bottom of the civil service system and then work your way back up. So you could be at a top level management leadership position in a private company. And then for altruistic reasons, you want to then serve in the public sector for trying to benefit the public interest. You would then have to give up that high level management position, go to the bottom of the civil service system and work your way up. Obviously, in our more open political culture, we had to have a mechanism for lateral entry. And so what we did is we made our system of civil service so that if you're in a management position in a private corporation, you can then enter the public sector laterally. So you can enter at a management level in the public sector. There's a very famous line, it's just one line, but there's one line in Wilson's writing that says, politics are the touchstone of administration. That's a very important caveat that he adds to this politics administration dichotomy. He says, yes, we need a separate field of study for administration, but we always have to remember that what we do in administration is going to be affected by our politics, by our political culture. Politics will always be that touchstone for administration. So politics served as the touchstone for taking closed examinations and transforming them into open examinations. Politics served as a touchstone for taking the British civil service system and transforming it into the American civil service system that allowed this lateral entry for people entering from the private sector. So even though Wilson's article is best known for this politics administration dichotomy, the truth of the matter is that today we know that there is not a clear line of separation between the political and the administrative world. As we said on previous slides, public administrators are involved in policy formulation as well as policy implementation. So that separation between the two worlds is not nearly as obvious as perhaps it was back in 1887 with Woodrow Wilson. But it's important to also note that even though public administrators are involved in both policy formulation and implementation, they're involved in both the political as well as the administrative world, their motivations still remain very different from elected officials. Elected officials' primary motivation for their involvement in the political world is to get reelected. A very famous book by David Mayhew back in the 1970s called Congress, the Electoral Connection, where Mayhew made the argument the primary motivation of any member of Congress is to try and get reelected. And they try and get reelected by taking positions on very non-controversial issues. They get reelected by trying to advertise their name so that their name becomes very well known among voters. The more name recognition you have, the better chance you have of getting elected or reelected. And they also take credit. They claim credit for popular types of programs. But they do all that for the purpose of getting reelected. That's their primary motivation. Hopefully for public administrators, because they are not running for reelection, hopefully one of their primary motivations is the creation of good policy. So the motivations are much different, even though they are both involved in the policy formulation type of process. But this politics administration dichotomy is what Woodrow Wilson is best known for, even though today we don't see that clear line of demarcation between the political and the administrative world. But his advocacy for a separate study of administration really created the foundation for the eventual field of public administration and what we do here in this program on a daily basis. So let's talk about this study of public administration that we do. There are three basic generalizations that Kettle tells us we can make about the study of public administration. One generalization is that public administration is timeless, yet it is also time-bound. Well, that's a pretty little phrase, but what does it mean? Public administration is timeless, meaning that there are certain maxims of administration that are as true today as they were in the 1800s. So, for instance, if you treat your employees well, we have learned through the human relations school that if you treat your employees well, you value your employees, then that will incentivize those employees to become more productive. We know that treating employees well can lead to organizational productivity. That's kind of a timeless maxim that underpins public administration. However, we also know that a lot of the theories we're going to talk about next week are very much time bound in that they are artifacts of their time. So scientific management that we'll talk about next week in the 19-teens and 1920s, a lot of those theories came out of the restlessness that was going on in the factory setting at that time. We had books like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and we know we had some horrific types of the situations going on in the workplace. And so the development of time motion studies and scientific management kind of grew out of what was going on at that time. So public administration was timeless, but it is also contextual in terms of when the theories are being developed. Public administration is universal, but it's also culture bound and varies according to the situation. So as we said, public administration is ubiquitous. We're surrounded on a daily basis by public administration. Just about every aspect of our lives is touched by public administration. However, we also have to realize the importance of the context of the situation. This is why I always say it depends is my idea of the most appropriate answer in the field of public administration, because it depends upon the context of the situation, the culture of the organization that you are operating within. So some of our theories are universal, but they have to be modified to fit within the context of the situation in which we are applying them. That's why you're doing an assessment-based midterm assessment, where you have scenarios and you are looking to apply these universal theories and concepts appropriately in those specific contexts. We also then know the third generalization is that public administration is complex, it's very complicated, but it's intelligible by simplified models or a step-by-step combining of models, meaning that it's a very complex world in public administration. That was the premise of Wilson's article, is that in the 1880s, public administration had become highly complex. Imagine if Woodrow Wilson saw public administration today and how complex it is today. Whenever you're trying to explain complex phenomena, you need to do it by creating theories and models. Whenever there's the need to create theories and models, that suggests the need for an academic discipline. Is one of the primary elements of an academic discipline is the creation of theories and models for understanding phenomena. So again, we're kind of building toward this discussion of public administration as a discipline. But before we get there, let's delve a little bit more in depth about this idea of complexity within public administration. and what makes public administration so complex that we need to develop these very models for trying to understand these complex phenomena. There are several factors that makes public administration complex. One factor is this interconnection between formulation and execution. Whenever you have a bleeding over of the lines between formulation and execution, it really muddies the waters. And it does make the study of public administration a little bit more complex and a little bit more difficult. Coordination is very important in today's public administration. When you think about how programs and policies are implemented, typically today, they're not implemented by one singular agency like they were in the past. Now they're being implemented through governing networks. And so you'll have multiple agencies working together in order to implement these programs. You may have public-private partnerships, partnering with private sector corporations. You may have public nonprofit partnerships. All of these governing networks require a lot of coordination between all the different entities that are implementing these policies. When you have all these different agencies working together, you need to know the relationships and the power structure between all these different agencies. The more the relationships you have, the more the imperative to understand who has the power in this relationship and how is this power being exercised, taking us back to John Gavetta and those three faces of power that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Public administration is also complex because it floats in the sea of time. What we had said before is that public administration really depends upon the context of the situation and the time period in which we are dealing with it. So a model or a theory may have worked well in the 1950s, but does not work quite as well today. A model or theory may have worked really well for the baby boomer generation, but doesn't work quite as well for Generation Z. And we know we go through these generational cycles in our public organizations. There are different hierarchical structures in public organizations as well that adds to that complexity. Some of our public organizations have a very top-down, tall hierarchical structure where you have one leader at the top of the organization. That as you go down the organizational pyramid, you encounter more and more positions. That's a tall hierarchy. That's kind of your classic structure for a bureaucratic organization. Some organizations are a little bit flatter and a little bit more bottom up, where they don't have that pyramidal organization structure. And instead, you have a lot of decision making that's devolved down to lower levels in the organization. The ubiquitous nature of information also causes a lot of complexity in public administration. Think about the sources of information today compared to the sources of information you may have had back in Woodrow Wilson's time. Today, we have information coming not just from government sources and social media and fake media sources. We really need to be very conscious consumers of information to make sure that we are basing our decisions on credible, verified information. Now, to add into this whole discussion, you now have the influence of artificial intelligence and things like generative AI and the role that generative AI is going to play in the future of public administration. One of the reasons that I allow generative AI to be used for the purpose of brainstorming and generating ideas is because I really do believe it's going to become a very important part of our decision-making calculus in the future of public administration. And I think if we just bury our heads in the sand and say no one can use AI, it's academic dishonesty, I think we're really doing ourselves a great disservice. The way in which our organizations are structured in terms of being structured on a headquarter basis or a field basis. Some of our organizations, everyone works in the same location in headquarters in Washington, D.C. or Sacramento, California, or Long Beach, California, but everyone works together all in the same location. Some of our organizations, like the Department of Agriculture, have a lot of field and regional offices, so they're dispersed throughout the entire country. Now, after the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, now we have a lot of hybrid and remote work arrangements. And so one burgeoning field of study in public administration is to examine how do we manage these remote workforces? How do we make sure these remote workforces are doing the work that they are supposed to be doing? How do we motivate people who are working in a remote environment? How do we build teamwork and kind of this esprit de corps between a workforce that may be working at locations hundreds or maybe of thousands of miles away? That's a major struggle that we're going to see in terms of a more complex public administration world over the next several years. Because a lot of this remote work, even though a lot of corporations have returned to in-person types of arrangements, a lot of government organizations are still permitting a lot of this remote work. And I think that the problem that organizations run into if they want to return everyone to the office is that if employees have demonstrated that they can work effectively in a remote setting, then it's difficult to come up with a justification for why they then have to return to a physical office space. So I think that we're going to continue to see a lot more remote and hybrid work in the future. And then obviously values. As we talked about last week, we have more values that we are trying to highlight in the public sector than perhaps just efficiency and effectiveness. In addition to efficiency and effectiveness, we have social equity. We have a focus on political responsiveness, on representative bureaucracy, on the protection of individual rights. And this becomes complex whenever one of those values comes into conflict with other values. It then requires us to, no pun intended, make value judgments, where we have to pick and choose between which values we want to place an emphasis upon, which makes our decision making obviously a lot more complex. The upshot of this complexity means that a complex world cannot be explained with abstract theories. That abstract theories will not give us the information we need to make sense of a complex reality. And also, a complex reality means that we cannot get away with developing just one single model or one single theory. We are going to need to develop multiple theories and multiple models to help explain this complex situation. As I've always said, complex problems require complex solutions. It's very rare that we can come up with a singular, simple solution to a very complex problem. Well, so what? My favorite question is so what? So let's ask that question. So what? What does this mean? This means that if we have this very complex environment that we have to try and understand, and if we have all this complexity within our organizations, we need to develop multiple theories and models to help explain all these complexities. When you have the need for multiple theories and models, that suggests for us the need for the development of an academic discipline. So let's spend a couple minutes talking about academic disciplines, what makes something an academic discipline, and then we can start to broach the question of, well, does public administration fit the bill? Does public administration fit these requirements to be an academic discipline? So when you look at a college campus, you're going to see all these different departments, oftentimes based upon different academic disciplines. So we have a discipline of history, of political science, of sociology, of engineering, of biology, of chemistry. We have all these different disciplines. So what makes up a discipline? What accounts for a discipline? Disciplines tend to look at unique phenomena, and then they use unique methods to develop unique theories to explain that phenomena. So again, we deal with unique phenomena that are different than the phenomena dealt with by other disciplines. We then develop unique methodologies for collecting information to measure those phenomena. And then we use that data we've collected to then generate unique theories to help us then explain the world around us and to explain those complex phenomena. That's typically what an academic discipline does. So let's compare a traditional discipline like political science with a traditional discipline like history. And I'll pick those two because my undergrad, I was a double major in political science and history. The way in which historians look at an issue is going to be different than the way in which political scientists look at it. So historians, when they measure phenomena, they focus much more on situations, much more on events than political scientists will. So the phenomena they're studying is a little bit different than the phenomena studied by political scientists. The methodologies they use will be much different between history and political science. The methods that you see used in history are oftentimes much more qualitative methods where they'll do things like a thematic content analysis. So they'll get writings that were done at the time and they will look for themes in those writings and then they'll categorize those themes and then compare those categorized themes to the themes that they find in other writings that are being done at a different period of time. That thematic content analysis is a very common approach used in history. Political science is called political science because it tends to be much more quantitative. We tend to use a lot more quantitative measures to measure our phenomena. So we will do things like using surveys and questionnaires and databases, and then we will extract data from those data collection methods. And then we might use multiple regression or probe it or logit or some other type of statistical analysis technique to analyze that numeric data. A much more quantitative science approach in political science as compared to the qualitative approach in history. And again, not that one is better than the other, they're just different ways in which we collect data, different methods of data collection. Then the theories that we create are also going to be a little bit different between the theories we create in history versus the theories we create in political science. In history, a lot of the theories we create are theories that explain that situation at that point in time. In political science, we take a more social science approach where we are trying to create theories that can then be extrapolated to then explain behaviors at multiple different points in time in multiple different situations. So we do much more of that extrapolation and generalization in political science than we may do in history. Whenever you're extrapolating findings, whenever you are generalizing findings, that's when statistics becomes very important because you have to say with what degree of confidence do you have that yes, these data that you have collected are reflective of an entire population or reflective of other situations as well. And so that's when we become very quantitative and very statistical. So you have those different types of approaches between history and political science. Our question, we're not answering this question tonight. I'm just going to broach the question now, and then we will revisit it again after the information we cover next week, because you'll kind of need the information next week in order to answer this question, is does the study of public administration demonstrate the elements of an academic discipline? Does it demonstrate unique phenomena? Does it demonstrate unique methods? Does it demonstrate unique theories and models that are being built? And once next week, we'll get into the theories of public administration. And I'll show you that public administration is very multidisciplinary in nature, in that a lot of the theories we're going to talk about next week come to us from different disciplines. So we'll talk about some theories that come to us from the world of business, like scientific management. We'll talk about some theories that come to us from the world of sociology. We'll talk about some theories like what we get from people like Elton Mayo and people like Abraham Maslow come to us from the world of psychology. We'll even make mention to some theories that come to us from the world of physics as well. And we'll talk about something like field theory and how that is derived from the world of physics. So we borrow from a lot of other disciplines. We then take those theories and we modify them to then make them match the public organizations that we are studying. And so just kind of keep that in mind as we go through all of our discussions of the theories next week, because hopefully by the end of our time together next week, you will be able to better answer this question of whether or not you think public administration is an academic discipline or if it is merely a subfield within another discipline. When I went through graduate school, I think I mentioned to you before that my PhD is in political science. And public administration, public policy, that was one of my comprehensive examination areas, along with presidency, Congress, and state and urban government. So it was one of 4 subfields that I specialized in my doctoral program. That's the way in which that program was run. Dr. Martin, who is a member of our faculty, has his PhD in public administration. And at Arizona State, it was a standalone public administration program. And so it was not a subfield, considered a subfield within political science. When you look at MPA programs around the country, you'll see that there are different administrative arrangements for MPA programs. Some MPA programs, a lot of them actually, are housed within a Department of Political Science. I'm doing an accreditation site visit in 2 weeks, and that program is housed within a division of politics. When I was at Ohio State, public administration was housed within the College of Business. And at that time, it was just a major within the College of Business, a department within the College of Business. So it was really kind of intermixed with a business type of an approach. Today, they now have their own School of Public Policy Administration, but back then it was a College of Business. We here at Cal State Long Beach, we are our own department, but we are housed within a College of Health and Human Services, which is a relatively unusual arrangement. It's not unprecedented. There are some programs around the country like that, but it certainly is in the minority, and it's a pretty unusual type of arrangement. We see some other MPA programs that are housed within departments of health studies, health sciences, healthcare management. I know we have several people in the class from the Masters in Public Health program. It's a very common arrangement to see health administration and public administration kind of combined together in the same department. So I don't think there really is a consensus as to whether or not public administration is a standalone discipline. There is no right or wrong answer here, but I think it's something we need to think about as students in an MPA program. And that's kind of the so what of the question. Well, why do we need to know this? We need to know this because if we're students in an MPA program, we really do need to understand what public administration is and perhaps what makes the study of public administration unique and different than the study of private administration and private corporations. So we'll fill in the rest of the blanks of this discussion next week when we talk about theoretical perspectives and the development of public administration theories over the years. And so that's where we're going to leave off with tonight. That's what we'll start up with then in our class next Tuesday. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to do some breakout groups. Now, again, we only have 10 people tonight. And so obviously we'll break up into 2 breakout groups, 5 people each. And let me go ahead and create those groups and then let me tell you what we are going to be doing. So let me create our breakout rooms. We'll do 2 of them. We will just randomly assign. And so I've created the rooms. What I would like for each group to do is I'd like for each group to pick a public organization. It could be one of the public organizations that you work for, or if you're not comfortable with that, you can pick any public organization that you would like and compare that public organization to a private sector corporation. So what are 2 main differences between the public organization and a corollary organization in the private sector? So what I'd like for each group to do, and we'll spend about maybe 20 minutes on this. It's a pretty straightforward type of assignment. First off, I want, whenever you get into your breakout room, I want you to agree upon a spokesperson because we're going to reconvene in a class after about 20 minutes, and then each group will share out what they came up with. So identify a spokesperson, and then settle on public organization that you want to focus on, and talk about 2 main differences between that public organization and somewhat of a similar organization in the private sector. Sound good? Any questions about what we're going to do in these breakout rooms? Okay. Then we'll spend about 20 minutes on it. So let me go ahead. I'll open the rooms and you can then head off into your rooms. And then I'll give you a little heads up when there's 5 minutes left and when there's a minute left. So you'll know when to wrap things up. So the rooms are now open. So feel free to go into your room and work together as a group.